Close your eyes and let the weight of the day drain away. Feel yourself sinking into the soft embrace of your bed, your breathing slowing, your mind drifting. Tonight, we embark on a journey through the dust of millennia, to a time when the world was born anew from the waters of destruction. We return to ancient Sumer, to the clay tablet that holds secrets whispered in the oldest written language on Earth. Tonight, we uncover what happened after the deluge. Tonight, we learn what the Anunnaki did when they came back. Before we begin this journey into the deep past, ignite that like button if you're ready to explore the mysteries of our oldest civilization. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. And as always with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. Thank you for always having our back. Now prepare yourself. Let the ancient world wash over you. And let's dive in. The silence after the flood must have been absolute. Imagine it. A world scrubbed clean, the cities that had stood for thousands of years reduced to silt and memory. The great ziggurat of Eridu, that stepped pyramid reaching toward heaven, toppled into rubble. The canals that had brought life to the desert, choked with debris. The fields that had fed tens of thousands, buried beneath layers of mud. The markets, the temples, the homes where families had laughed and argued and lived. All of it gone, swallowed by water that came from below and above, a biblical catastrophe that erased nearly everything humanity had built. According to the Sumerian tablets, discovered in the ruins of ancient Nippur and scattered across Mesopotamia, this was not myth. This was memory. The Eridu Genesis, written in cuneiform script around 1600 years before the Common Era, tells us that the flood lasted 7 days and 7 nights. 7 days of howling wind and torrential rain, 7 days of watching the world drown. And when it finally stopped, when the sun god Utu broke through the clouds and cast his rays upon the devastation, what remained? A single boat. A massive vessel sealed with bitumen, tossed upon great waters that stretched to every horizon. Inside, a man named Ziusudra. In later versions, he would be called Utnapishtim. In the biblical tradition, he would become Noah. But in the oldest telling, in the Sumerian original, his name was Ziusudra, which means he who saw life, or he who lengthened the days of life. He was the last king of the city of Shuruppak, and he was, for a brief and terrible moment, the last man on earth. The tablet tells us that Ziusudra opened a window of his great boat. The hero king prostrated himself before Utu, the sun god and Unearthing god. He made sacrifices. The smoke rose into the clean-washed sky, and the gods, who had fled to the highest heaven during the deluge, came down. They gathered like flies around the sweet smoke, the text says, because they were starving. The gods had not received offerings for 7 days. Their temples were gone, their cities were gone, and most importantly, their worshippers were gone. The humans they had created, the workers they had engineered to tend the earth and make offerings, had been wiped away. The decision to destroy humanity, made in anger by the god Enlil, who could not sleep through the noise of civilization, had worked too well. But now, in the aftermath, standing on the muddy shores of a world remade, the Anunnaki faced a choice. They could abandon this experiment entirely. They could return to wherever they had come from, whether that was the planet Nibiru, as fringe theorists suggest, or simply the cosmic realm of the gods, as mainstream scholars believe. Or they could start again. They could rebuild. And according to the tablets, that is exactly what they decided to do. The Sumerian King List, that ancient document preserved on clay prisms and tablets, tells us what happened next with remarkable specificity. It states bluntly and without drama, then the flood swept over. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. Not Eridu, not the first city. The cosmic reset button had been pressed, and when civilization rebooted, it booted up in a different location. Power had shifted. The old world was dead. But the Anunnaki were not done with humanity. In fact, their work was just beginning. To understand what the Anunnaki did after the flood, we must first understand what the tablets tell us about their motivations before it. This is not a tale of benevolent creators watching over their children with loving eyes. The Sumerian texts are remarkably, almost brutally clear about the relationship between gods and humans. Humanity was not created out of love. Humanity was created to work. The Atrahasis epic, one of the most complete accounts of both the creation of humans and the flood that nearly destroyed them, begins not with humanity at all, but with a labour dispute among the gods themselves. The text describes how the great Anunnaki, the senior gods, had enslaved the lesser gods, the Igigi, forcing them to dig the great rivers, to dredge canals to build mountains. For 40 years the Igigi laboured, and then, in a scene that would resonate with any modern union organiser, they revolted. They burned their tools, they surrounded the house of Enlil, the commander of Earth operations, and they refused to work another day. The solution proposed by Enki, the clever god of wisdom and water, was as ingenious as it was cold. He suggested they create a replacement workforce, a primitive worker, a being intelligent enough to follow instructions but not intelligent enough to question them. Using genetic material from a slain god named Geshtu-i, who possessed intelligence mixed with the clay of the earth and implanted into the wombs of goddess surrogates, the first humans were born, the Lulu Amalu, the mixed ones, us. We were made to serve, to dig irrigation canals, to farm the fields, to tend the livestock, and most importantly, according to the tablets, to mine gold. The fringe theory, popularised by researcher Zecharia Sitchin, suggests this gold was needed to repair the atmosphere of the Anunnaki home planet. Mainstream scholars dismiss this as pure speculation, pointing out that the texts speak of gold simply as a precious commodity, a symbol of divine wealth and power. But either way, the tablets are clear. Humanity's purpose was labour. Our existence was utilitarian. We were biological machines, engineered for a task. And we were good at it, too good perhaps. The texts tell us that humanity multiplied rapidly. We spread across the land. We built cities of our own. We became noisy. This is a recurring theme in Mesopotamian flood narratives that modern readers often find darkly funny. The great catastrophe, the near extinction of the human race, happened not because we are wicked, though later traditions would add moral failings to the story. The original Sumerian version is far more mundane and far more unsettling. Enlil wanted to destroy humanity because we were too loud. We disturbed his sleep. 1200 years had not yet passed, the Atrahasis tablet records, when the land extended and the peoples multiplied. The land was bellowing like a bull. The god got disturbed with their uproar. Enlil heard their noise and addressed the great gods. The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar I am deprived of sleep. So he made the decision. Wipe them out, start over, impose silence on the earth. But Enki, who had mixed the clay and the divine essence to create humanity in the first place, could not bring himself to see his creation utterly destroyed. So he went to the reed wall of a house in the city of Shurupak. He did not speak directly to the man inside, for he had sworn an oath of secrecy to the council of gods. Instead, he whispered to the wall itself. Knowing full well that Ziusudra was listening on the other side, he gave him the dimensions of a boat. He told him to seal it with bitumen. He instructed him to bring aboard his family and the seed of all living creatures. And then Enki returned to heaven, and the storm came. 7 days and 7 nights. The younger gods fled to the highest heaven and cowered there like dogs. Even Enlil's wrath, it seems, unleashed something that terrified the divine themselves. The cosmic forces of chaos, once released, threatened to unmake not just humanity but the ordered world the Anunnaki had established. When it finally ended, when Ziusudra's boat came to rest and he opened the window and made his sacrifice, the gods gathered around the smoke, not in triumph but in relief and hunger. They had nearly destroyed themselves in their attempt to destroy us. It was at this moment, in the aftermath of their own cosmic tantrum, that the Anunnaki made a new decision. Enlil was furious that any human had survived, but Enki argued passionately before the council. Humanity, he said, should be allowed to continue. There would be new rules, new controls, new methods of population management that did not involve drowning the entire world. The text suggests famines, diseases, predators, things that would keep human numbers in check without requiring divine intervention on such a catastrophic scale. The gods, it seems, learned from their mistake. Total annihilation was too messy, too risky. What they needed was not extinction, but management. And so the great project of rebuilding began. The Eridu Genesis tablet, though badly damaged, preserves a remarkable passage describing what happened next. When the text resumes after the flood, the mother goddess Nintur, also called Ninhursag, is speaking. She is planning to provide kingship and organisation to humanity once again. The passage then names the first cities to be established after the deluge, and the order is significant. First came Eridu, the oldest and most sacred city home to Enki, god of wisdom. Eridu was placed under his direct supervision. Archaeological excavations at the site of Tel Abu Shahrain in southern Iraq have revealed that Eridu was indeed one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements in human history, with foundations dating back to at least 5,400 BCE. The site shows evidence of repeated rebuilding, with temple structures constructed one on top of another over thousands of years, creating a tell, an artificial mound formed by successive layers of human habitation. The excavations, conducted first by British archaeologist John George Taylor in 1855, and later by Iraqi archaeologist Fuad Safar and British archaeologist Seton Lloyd in the 1940s, uncovered 18 superimposed temples at the site, each built upon the ruins of the last. This pattern of destruction and rebuilding speaks to repeated catastrophes, whether from flooding, warfare, or environmental collapse. The oldest temples were simple reed structures, but over time they evolved into massive mud brick edifices, culminating in an unfinished ziggurat begun by the ruler Amar-Sin around 2047 BCE. The city's importance was not merely political or economic, it was sacred. Eridu was believed to be the point where civilization itself began, where kingship descended from heaven. After Eridu came Bad Tabira, then Larak, then Sippar, and finally Shuruppak, the city from which Ziusudra himself had sailed. These 5 cities, the Eridu's Genesis tells us, were established as distributive economies, not monetary systems based on trade and currency, but organised systems where resources were allocated from central authorities. In other words, planned economies overseen by temple administrators who answered ultimately to the gods. This was not democracy, this was divine bureaucracy. The tablets indicate that each city was placed under the protection of a specific deity. Eridu belonged to Enki, Bad Tabira was given to the sun god Shamash, Larak to Pabilsag, a warrior god, Sippar to Shamash as well, though some versions credit the sun goddess, and Shuruppak was overseen by Sud, a grain goddess, later known as Dutur. The message was clear: humanity would be allowed to rebuild, but under direct divine supervision. The cities were not truly ours, they were theirs, we were merely tenants, and the Anunnaki were the landlords who had decided, after serious consideration, not to evict us permanently. But who would manage these cities on a day-to-day basis? The gods could not be everywhere at once, they needed intermediaries, they needed a human leadership class. And so, the tablets tell us, kingship was lowered from heaven a second time. The Sumerian King List records this moment with the same matter-of-fact tone it uses for everything else. After the flood, when kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Kish. The first post-flood king was named Ga-ur, whose name has also been read as Jushur. He ruled for 1,200 years. Modern scholars immediately note that these reign lengths, while impossibly long by human standards, are dramatically shorter than the pre-flood kings. Alulim, the first king before the deluge, supposedly ruled for 28,800 years. Alalngar ruled for 36,000 years. But after the flood, we see reign lengths measured in the hundreds rather than tens of thousands. The pattern continues down through the dynasties until, by the time we reach historical figures like Gilgamesh of Uruk, whose reign is dated to approximately 2700 BCE, we see a rule of 126 years. Still long, but approaching the realm of the believable, especially if we consider that these numbers might represent dynasties rather than individuals. Mainstream historians view this as evidence that the King List is a mythological document that gradually blends into actual history. The long reigns are symbolic, perhaps representing entire eras rather than single rulers. But fringe theorists, following Sitchin's interpretations, see something else. They see a genetic dilution. The pre-flood kings, they argue, were either Anunnaki themselves or direct Anunnaki human hybrids with extended lifespans. After the flood, only pure humans remained, saved by Ziusudra. These humans would have normalish lifespans, though the King List suggests they were still considerably longer than ours today. Perhaps the post-flood world, with its cleaner environment and direct divine oversight, allowed for greater longevity. Or perhaps the numbers are simply inflated by scribes attempting to glorify their rulers. We cannot know for certain. What we do know from the tablets is that these post-flood kings were not merely symbolic figureheads. They were builders, administrators, priests. They were the interface between heaven and earth, responsible for maintaining the temples, organising labour for public works, adjudicating disputes, and most importantly, ensuring that the offerings to the gods continued without interruption. Because this, according to the texts, was humanity's primary function. We fed the gods through sacrifice. Our smoke rose, their favour descended, and the cycle continued. But the Anunnaki's rebuilding project after the flood was not simply about re-establishing cities and installing kings, it was about transferring knowledge. And this is where the story becomes truly fascinating, where the line between mythology and something more begins to blur in unexpected ways. The Sumerians did not view their civilization as something they had invented, they saw it as something that had been given to them. The concept of the me, pronounced may, is central to understanding this worldview. The me were divine decrees, fundamental principles that governed civilization. They were not abstract concepts. The texts described them as physical objects, things that could be held, worn, transferred, or even stolen. There were said to be over 100 me, covering everything from kingship and priesthood to writing and music, from metallurgy to sexual intercourse, from law and order to destruction and chaos. In Sumerian mythology, the me were originally held by Enki in his temple at Eridu, stored in the Abzu, the cosmic freshwater ocean beneath the earth where he dwelt. In one of the most famous myths, the goddess Inanna, patron of the great city of Uruk, travels to Eridu to visit Enki. She gets him drunk on beer, and in his inebriated state he gives her more than 100 of the me. She loads them onto her boat and sails triumphantly back to Uruk. When Enki sobers up and realises what he has done, he sends servants to chase her and retrieve the me. But Inanna successfully defends her cargo and brings the gifts of civilization to her city. Mainstream scholars interpret this myth as a political allegory, explaining how Uruk superseded Eridu as the dominant city in southern Mesopotamia. The story symbolises the transfer of cultural and political power from south to north, from the old religious centre to a new, more economically vibrant urban centre. But notice the underlying assumption in the myth itself. Civilization, writing, law, technology, all of it came from the gods. It came from Enki. Humanity did not invent these things through slow trial and error. They were given to us deliberately as tools to rebuild what had been lost. The post-flood world, according to the tablets, saw a systematic distribution of this knowledge. Enki, having saved humanity through Ziusudra, now ensured that humanity could survive without constant divine intervention. He gave them agriculture, teaching them which plants to domesticate, how to plough, how to irrigate, how to store grain for lean times. The Sumerian text known as Instruction to a Farmer, preserved from the 16th century BCE, but likely much older in origin, reads like a technical manual. It describes step by step how to prepare fields, when to sow, how to manage water, how to harvest and thresh and winnow. This was knowledge that meant the difference between feast and famine. Enki's gifts extended beyond farming. The Sumerians credited him with teaching humanity the art of writing itself. The earliest forms of writing discovered by archaeologists are the clay tokens and pictographs from Uruk, dating to around 3400 BCE. These began as simple accounting marks, ways to track quantities of grain, livestock, and beer. But within centuries, the system had evolved into true cuneiform, sophisticated script capable of recording not just numbers, but stories, laws, prayers, and history. The speed of this development is what catches the attention of alternative historians. From no writing to complex literacy in a few hundred years. Was this natural human innovation? Or was it, as the Sumerians themselves believed, a gift from the gods? The tablets also credit the Anunnaki with teaching mathematics. The Sumerian sexagesimal system, based on the number 60, is still with us today. We use it every time we read a clock, every time we measure an angle in degrees. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. This mathematical system was sophisticated enough to handle complex calculations, including square roots and geometric progressions. Babylonian astronomical tablets, written centuries after the Sumerians, but using their mathematical foundations, show calculations that allowed them to predict eclipses and track planetary movements with startling accuracy. Where did this knowledge come from? The mainstream answer is that it developed gradually, passed down and refined over generations of careful observation and record-keeping. But the alternative theory asks a provocative question. If a technologically advanced civilization, whether extraterrestrial as Sitchin proposed, or simply a lost human civilization as other researchers suggest, wanted to give a recovering post-catastrophe society the tools to rebuild, what would they give them? They would give them practical knowledge. agriculture, mathematics, writing, engineering, astronomy for tracking seasons and floods, metallurgy for making tools, law for maintaining social order. In other words, exactly what the Sumerians said the Anunnaki gave them. The 7 sages, the Apkallu, appear repeatedly in Mesopotamian tradition as the teachers of humanity. These were semi-divine beings, often depicted as fishmen, or as men wearing the skin of fish like cloaks, who came from the Abzu, from Enki's watery realm, to instruct humans in the arts of civilization. The first of these sages was named Adapa, sometimes called Uan, who served the first king of Eridu, Alulim, in the distant time before the flood. But the tradition held that sages continued to appear after the deluge as well, ensuring that the knowledge was not lost. Were these sages literal beings? Were they, as some theories suggest, Anunnaki themselves, taking on physical forms to walk among humans as teachers? Or were they simply wise men, perhaps survivors of the old world, who carried the memories and knowledge of the previous age? The texts leave this tantalizingly unclear. What they emphasize again and again is that humanity's rapid development was not a miracle of human ingenuity alone. It was guided. It was taught. It was, in the Sumerian worldview, a continuation of the divine project that had begun when Enki first mixed clay and divine blood in his laboratory. The rebuilt cities of post-flood Sumer were architectural marvels. At the centre of each stood a ziggurat, a massive step, pyramid of mud brick that dominated the landscape. These were not tombs like the pyramids of Egypt, they were temples, and more specifically, they were seen as homes, as landing platforms, as connection points between heaven and earth. The ziggurat of Ur, one of the best preserved examples, gives us a sense of the scale. Its base measured about 210 by 150 feet, and it rose in 3 great terraces to a height of roughly 80 feet. At its summit stood a shrine, the residence of the moon god Nana. The construction of these ziggurats required immense resources and sophisticated engineering. The bricks had to be fired in kilns requiring vast amounts of fuel. The structure had to be stable despite being built on soft, flood-prone alluvial soil. Drainage systems had to be incorporated to prevent water damage, and the whole edifice had to be maintained constantly, as the harsh environment of southern Mesopotamia, with its seasonal floods and sandstorms, would quickly erode any structure left untended. Some mainstream archaeologists now believe that the regular maintenance and rebuilding of these temples, documented in the archaeological record, may reflect not just weathering but repeated catastrophic flood events that damaged the structures. The tablets tell us that the building of these temples was not a human initiative. The gods commanded their construction. Kings who wanted to remain in divine favour would rebuild and expand the temples, leaving inscriptions detailing their pious works. King Ur-Nammu of the 3rd dynasty of Ur, around 2100 BCE, left a stele showing him with builder's tools, personally participating in the construction of the ziggurat. But he makes it clear in the inscription that he is doing this at the command of the moon god Nana. The temple is not his idea, it is divine instruction, and he is merely the obedient servant carrying it out. The fringe interpretation sees these ziggurats not as symbolic structures but as functional ones. With their terraced platforms and summit shrines, they look to the modern eye strikingly like launch facilities or communication towers. Were they, as ancient astronaut theorists propose, landing pads for the craft of the Anunnaki? Were the summit shrines control rooms or refueling stations? The academic response is clear. There is no evidence for this interpretation. The ziggurats were temples, centres of religious and economic life. The summit shrines were small, modest structures, where priests would perform rituals, make offerings, and observe the heavens. They were not spaceports. But the theory persists, in part because of something the tablets themselves emphasize. The gods did not stay in heaven after the flood. They returned, they came down, they dwelt in their temples. The Eridu's Genesis states explicitly that after the flood, the Anunnaki took up their dwellings among the people of Sumer. This was not distant, hands-off governance. This was a physical presence. And if the Anunnaki were physical beings, whether gods in the traditional sense or something else, then they needed physical spaces. They needed homes. They needed, the texts tell us, exactly what the Sumerians built for them. The organisation of post-flood Sumerian society is documented in thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. These are not myths or legends. These are administrative records, receipts, inventories, ration lists, employment contracts, legal judgments, the everyday paperwork of a functioning civilization. and they reveal a society that was intensely hierarchical and bureaucratic. At the top were the gods, represented on Earth by their temples. Each temple was not just a place of worship, but an economic institution, owning vast tracts of land, employing hundreds or thousands of workers, storing grain and goods, making loans, conducting trade. The Temple of Inakana in Uruk, for example, was essentially a state within a state, with its own administration, its own workforce, its own economy. Below the temples were the kings, who served as high priests and military leaders. They were responsible for maintaining the irrigation systems that made agriculture possible in the desert, for organising defensive walls against rival cities, and for ensuring that the gods received their due. A king who failed in these duties could expect divine retribution, usually in the form of military defeat or natural disaster. Below the kings were the scribes and priests, the educated elite who could read and write, who kept the records and performed the rituals. Then came the craftsmen, the soldiers, the farmers, the labourers. And at the bottom were the slaves, prisoners of war or those who had sold themselves into bondage to pay debts. This was not an egalitarian paradise. This was a stratified society with clear divisions of power and wealth. But it was a society that worked, that produced enough surplus to support cities of tens of thousands, that built monuments that lasted millennia, that created literature that we still read today. The tablets make clear that this social structure was not viewed as a human invention. It was once again divinely ordained. Kingship came from heaven. The laws were given by the gods. Even the specific duties of various professions were seen as part of the me, the sacred principles established at the beginning of civilization. When the great lawgiver Hammurabi of Babylon, ruling around 1750 BCE, created his famous law code, he did not claim to have invented it. In the prologue to his laws, carved on a black stone stele, he states clearly that he was chosen by the gods Anu and Enlil to promote the welfare of the people, to cause justice to prevail in the land. The laws were not his, they were divine. He was merely the administrator, ensuring they were properly applied. This is the pattern we see again and again in the post-flood tablets. Humanity was given a system. We were given the tools, the knowledge, the social structures necessary to create stable civilization, and we were given supervisors, the kings and priests who maintained communication with the Anunnaki and ensured that the divine will was carried out. The experiment had nearly failed. The flood had nearly ended everything. But the Anunnaki, having decided to give humanity a second chance, were taking no risks this time. They established tighter control, more direct oversight, clear hierarchies, regular communication through temple rituals and oracles, and it worked. Post-flood Sumer flourished. The city-states grew wealthy through agriculture and trade. Scribal schools trained new generations of literate bureaucrats. Artists created magnificent sculptures and cylinder seals. Poets composed epics that grappled with fundamental questions of human existence. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the world's oldest surviving great work of literature, comes from this period. It tells of Gilgamesh's quest for immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu, his journey to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who had been granted eternal life by the gods. In that story, Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the tale of the deluge, ensuring that the memory of the catastrophe was preserved. The flood, in Sumerian consciousness, was not ancient history. It was the defining event that separated the old world from the new. Everything after was post-flood. Everything after was the age of rebuilding, the age when humanity and gods worked together, however uneasily, to restore what had been lost. But as the centuries passed, something began to change. The tablets from the later period show a subtle but significant shift. The gods, once so present, so involved in daily affairs, began to withdraw. They became more distant. The direct appearances stopped. The clear instructions became rare. The kings still claimed divine authority, still performed the ancient rituals in the temples, still made the required offerings. But the sense of immediate, tangible divine presence faded. By the time we reach the Babylonian period, around 1800 BCE, the myths themselves reflect this change. In the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, the god Marduk rises to supremacy over the older Anunnaki. He defeats the chaos dragon Tiamat, creates the cosmos from her body, and establishes Babylon as the centre of the world. The older gods recede into the background. Marduk, a relatively young deity in the Mesopotamian pantheon, becomes the focus. This shift mirrors the political reality. As Babylon gained dominance over the older Sumerian cities, but it also reflects a theological evolution. The old gods, the Anunnaki who had created humanity and survived the flood, were becoming figures of the past, honoured but no longer active participants in the affairs of the world. What happened to them? The texts do not say explicitly, they simply fade from the narrative. Some tablets suggest they retired to their heavenly realm, satisfied that humanity had stabilised and no longer required such intensive management. Others imply conflict among the gods themselves, leading to a withdrawal or a change in the divine hierarchy. The fringe theories, of course, have their own explanations. Perhaps the Anunnaki returned to their home planet Nibiru as its 3,600-year orbit carried it back into the depths of space. Perhaps they went underground, establishing hidden bases from which they could observe humanity without interfering. Perhaps they never left at all, but simply stopped revealing themselves, choosing to guide from the shadows through chosen bloodlines and secret societies. What we know from archaeology is that Sumerian civilization did not end abruptly. It gradually evolved and was absorbed by successive empires. The Akkadians under Sargon the Great conquered the Sumerian city-states around 2334 BCE, creating the first true empire in Mesopotamia. But the Akkadians adopted Sumerian culture wholesale, continuing to use the Sumerian language for religious texts and learning, even as Akkadian became the language of daily life. Later came the Babylonians, then the Assyrians, then the Persians, then Alexander the Great and the Greeks. Each empire built upon what came before, preserving and transmitting the knowledge and stories of Sumer. The Sumerian language itself, the world's oldest written language, eventually died as a spoken tongue. But it lived on for thousands of years as a language of scholarship and religion, much like Latin in medieval Europe. Scribes in Babylon, long after Sumer had fallen, still learned to read the ancient tablets. They still copied the old myths. The story of the flood, the tale of the Anunnaki, the memory of the time when gods walked the earth, these were kept alive, passed down, translated, adapted, but never forgotten. And then, for a very long time, they were forgotten. The last cuneiform tablets were written in the 1st century of the Common Era. After that, the ability to read the wedge-shaped script was lost. The tablets remained buried in the ruins of Mesopotamian cities for over 1800 years, waiting in the dust for someone to find them and decipher them once more. When archaeologists finally did, when George Smith at the British Museum translated the flood story from the Epic of Gilgamesh in 1872 and announced that he had found a version of Noah's flood that predated the Bible by 1,000 years, it caused a sensation. Here was proof that the biblical stories had deeper roots, that they drew upon older traditions. And as more tablets were translated, as the full scope of Sumerian literature and history became clear, scholars realised they were looking at the foundation of Western civilization itself. But they were also looking at something stranger. They were looking at texts that claimed, consistently and insistently, that humanity had been guided, that we had been taught, that our rapid rise from Stone Age villages to Bronze Age cities with writing and law and mathematics and astronomy was not entirely our own doing. The Sumerians themselves, the people who created the world's first civilization, did not take credit for it. They gave credit to the Anunnaki. How do we interpret this? The mainstream view is clear and grounded in solid scholarly consensus. The Anunnaki were gods in the traditional religious sense. They were powerful spiritual entities, personifications of natural forces and cosmic principles. The stories of creation, the flood, the teaching of civilization, these were myths, attempts by an ancient people to explain their world and their place in it. The rapid development of Sumerian civilization was indeed remarkable, but it can be explained by favourable environmental conditions, the invention of agriculture, the development of irrigation, and human ingenuity and adaptability. The Sumerians attributed their success to divine intervention because that is what people do. We create gods to explain what we do not understand, but the alternative interpretation, popularised by Sitchin and embraced by ancient astronaut theorists, offers a very different reading. What if the Sumerians were not creating myths? What if they were recording history as best they could with the language and concepts available to them? If a primitive people encountered beings with advanced technology, how would they describe them? They would call them gods. If those beings arrived in flying craft, those craft would become celestial boats or chariots of the gods. If they demonstrated advanced knowledge of genetics, astronomy and engineering, that knowledge would be seen as divine wisdom. And if they helped humanity rebuild after a catastrophe, Their actions would be remembered in exactly the way the tablets remember them, as gods coming down from heaven, re-establishing civilization, teaching humanity, and then eventually withdrawing. The truth, as always, likely lies somewhere in the complex middle ground. The tablets are not video recordings. They are not objective historical documents. They are the stories a culture told itself, shaped by the theology, politics, and the limitations of human memory over vast spans of time. But they are also not pure fiction. They contain within them the distilled experiences, fears, and awe of the people who wrote them. What we can say with certainty is this. After some great catastrophe, whether a localized flood or a more widespread disaster, the Sumerian civilization rebuilt itself with remarkable speed and sophistication. Within a few centuries of the flood layer found by archaeologists in the soil of Mesopotamian cities, dated to around 2900 BCE, we see the full flowering of urban civilization. Cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants, complex irrigation systems, monumental architecture, a sophisticated writing system, advanced mathematics and astronomy. This is not the slow, grinding progress of a society starting from scratch. This is rapid development, suggesting that knowledge and social structures were not lost but preserved and transmitted. And the Sumerians themselves insisted they had help. They insisted that what they built according to a divine plan. They insisted that their kings ruled by a heavenly decree. They insisted that their laws, their rituals, their entire social order came from the gods. Whether those gods were spiritual entities, extraterrestrial visitors, or the fragmented memory of an earlier human civilization that fell and imparted its knowledge to the survivors, we cannot definitively say. What we can say is that the tablets, in their own voice, tell us exactly what happened after the flood. The Anunnaki came back, they surveyed the deluge, they found Ziusudra and his family. They made a decision not to abandon their experiment but to continue it under new conditions. They established new cities, with Eridu rebuilt first as the sacred centre. They lowered kingship from heaven, installing human intermediaries to manage daily affairs. They distributed the me, the gifts of civilization, ensuring that humanity had the tools and knowledge needed to thrive. They built new temples, new connection points between heaven and earth, and they oversaw the reconstruction of a world that had nearly ended. For a time, perhaps generations, perhaps centuries, this new arrangement held. The gods dwelt among humanity. Kings consulted with them directly. Priests entered the innermost sanctums of the temples and emerged with divine messages. The system worked. And then, gradually, the gods withdrew. They left behind their temples, their laws, their cities, their stories. They left behind a blueprint for civilization that would be copied and adapted by every culture that followed. And they left behind a lingering question, preserved in clay and etched in the oldest writing on earth. What were the Anunnaki? Who were they really? And if they came once, if they created us, taught us, guided us, and then departed, will they come back again? The tablets do not answer this question. They end not with a conclusion, but with a silence. The gods fade from the record. Humanity, their creation or their experiment or their children, depending on how you read the texts, is left to continue alone. And perhaps that was always the plan. Perhaps the post-flood world, with its tighter controls and clearer hierarchies, was a training ground. Humanity had proven itself capable of thriving under direct supervision. The question was whether we could thrive without it. And so the Anunnaki, having taught us everything we needed to know, having established the structures of civilization and ensured they would perpetuate themselves, withdrew. They did not abandon us. They simply stepped back. They let go, and they watched to see what we would do. But before we reach that ending, before we arrive at the moment of divine withdrawal, we must linger longer in the world they built. We must walk through the streets of these post-flood cities. We must stand in the temples where the rituals were performed. We must understand in intimate detail what it meant to live in a civilization that believed, with absolute certainty, that gods walked among them and demanded daily service. Picture yourself now in the city of Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, approximately 2500 BCE. The sun has not yet risen, but the city is already stirring. You stand outside the great temple of Enlil, the Eker, whose name means mountain house. This is not merely a building. It is, according to the Sumerians, the dwelling place of the god himself. The ziggurat rises before you, its mud brick sides catching the first pale light of dawn. You can smell the incense already burning, the myrrh and cedar smoke drifting down from the upper levels. Inside the temple complex, a world unto itself, the priests have been awake for hours. The chief priest, dressed in immaculate white linen, has already bathed in sacred water drawn from the temple's well, water that connects to the Abzu, the cosmic freshwater ocean beneath the earth. He has anointed himself with oil infused with the scent of cypress and juniper. He has recited the prayers of purification, each word precisely as it was taught to him by his father, who learned it from his father, stretching back in an unbroken chain to the time immediately after the flood when kingship was lowered from heaven. The statue of Enlil waits in the innermost sanctuary, the cellar. It is carved from precious cedar wood imported from distant Lebanon, overlaid with sheets of hammered gold. The eyes are inlaid with lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, giving the god a gaze that seems to penetrate into your very soul. The Sumerians believed this statue was not a symbol, it was not a representation, it was the god. Enlil's divine essence, his Melam, his terrifying radiance resided within this form. To look directly at it unprepared was to risk being struck blind, your eyes burned by the intensity of divine presence. The awakening ritual begins. The chief priest approaches the sanctuary with careful, measured steps. Behind him, a line of junior priests carry trays laden with the morning offerings. The priest chants the ancient words, his voice rising in the pre-dawn darkness. Enlil, great mountain, father of the gods, whose word is destiny, whose utterance is unchangeable, who decrees the fates, rise from your rest. The land awaits your judgment. Your servants await your commands. He pulls back the curtain that separates the god's bedchamber from the outer sanctuary. The ritual texts describe this moment with precision. The god has been sleeping. Like any great lord, he must be woken gently, respectfully. The priests understood that to startle a god from sleep could bring catastrophe upon the entire city. So the awakening is done with music, with soft chanting, with the gentle tinkling of bronze bells. The statue is addressed as though it were a living person just opening its eyes to a new day. Once awakened, the god must be clothed. The priests remove the previous day's garments, handling them with reverence, for they have absorbed the divine essence and must be treated as sacred objects. New robes are brought, dyed in the deepest blues and purples, colours reserved for royalty and divinity. The fabric is Mesopotamian fine wool, woven by the temple's own weavers, women who have dedicated their lives to creating garments worthy of the gods. The priests dress the statue carefully, adjusting each fold, ensuring that the god is properly attired to receive visitors and conduct the business of the day. Then comes the first meal. 2 courses, prepared in the temple kitchens by cooks who are themselves priests, trained in the sacred art of divine cuisine. The texts from the ancient city of Puzuris Dagan near Nippur list the provisions stored for the gods. The quantities are staggering. Thousands of cattle, tens of thousands of sheep and goats, grain measured in the tens of thousands of bushels, dates, figs, honey, milk, cheese, and vast amounts of beer. Beer was not simply a beverage in Sumer, it was sacred, a gift from the goddess Ninkasi, and it flowed like water at every ritual. The morning meal is set before the statue on offering tables of carved alabaster, roasted meat, still steaming, freshly baked bread made from the finest barley flour, bowls of fruit arranged in perfect geometric patterns, jugs of beer and milk, plates of dates soaked in honey, wine imported from the highlands, crimson and fragrant. The priests recite prayers as each dish is placed, thanking the god for his continued protection, asking for his blessings on the crops, on the flocks, on the king, on the city itself. And then they wait. The god must be given time to consume the meal, not physically, of course, though the texts are sometimes ambiguous on this point. The god consumes the essence of the food, the vital force within it. After a suitable interval, measured by water clocks or by counting ritual formulas, the priests return, they remove the offerings. The food has been blessed by contact with the divine. It is now imbued with sacred power, and because the gods, being incorporeal in their true forms, cannot actually eat physical food in the way humans do, the blessed offerings become the property of the priests. They will eat what the god has touched, absorbing some small measure of divine grace with each bite. It is a practical system. The god is fed, the priests are fed, the cosmic order is maintained. This ritual repeats in the evening. 2 meals a day every day for as long as the city stands. Failure to perform this duty is unthinkable. To let the god go hungry is to invite divine wrath. Famine, flood in Viesian. The priests know the stories. They know what happened before the flood when humanity grew too noisy and too careless in their worship. They will not make that mistake again. But feeding the god is only the beginning of the day's duties. Throughout the morning, worshippers arrive at the outer courtyards of the temple. They bring their own offerings. A farmer arrives with a lamb, the firstborn of his flock. A merchant comes with a bolt of fine linen from Egypt. A widow brings a small clay jar of honey, all she can afford, hoping that Enlil will notice her devotion and ease her suffering. The outer priests receive these offerings, record them meticulously on clay tablets, and convey them into the temple's deeper chambers. Nothing is forgotten. Every sheep, every jar, every coin is accounted for. The Temple of Enlil at Nippur is not just a religious institution, it is an economic powerhouse. The temple owns thousands of acres of farmland, worked by tenant farmers who pay a portion of their harvest as rent. It owns vast herds of livestock managed by shepherds employed by the temple. It operates breweries, bakeries, and textile workshops. It makes loans to merchants and farmers, charging interest, accumulating wealth. By some estimates, the major temples controlled a third of the entire wealth of their cities, and all of this economic activity is justified by a single principle. It all belongs to the god. The priests are merely stewards, managing the god's estate on his behalf. The temple complex is a small city within the city. Hundreds of people live and work here. There are the high priests, the chief administrators, who commune directly with the god and interpret his will. There are the common priests who perform the daily rituals, who maintain the altars, who ensure that the incense never stops burning. There are the temple musicians, both male and female, who play the harp and the lyre and the drum during ceremonies. Archaeological records from Lagash mention 62 lamentation priests accompanied by 180 vocalists and instrumentalists. Imagine the sound of that choir rising in the temple courts, voices and instruments blending in complex harmonies that were believed to soothe the god's troubled heart when disaster threatened. There are the scribes, the record keepers, young men who have spent years in the temple schools learning the intricately complex cuneiform script. They sit cross-legged in the shade of the temple walls, pressing their reed styluses into wet clay, recording everything. How much grain came in from the southern fields? How many lambs were sacrificed this month? Which merchant borrowed silver and promised to repay it at harvest time? These tablets, tens of thousands of them, are the reason we know so much about Sumerian life. They were not literature. They were receipts, inventories, legal documents, the mundane paperwork of a functioning theocratic state. There are the craftsmen, goldsmiths who create the ornaments for the god's statue, stone carvers who maintain and repair the temple's many sculptures, weavers who make not just the god's clothing but the curtains, the carpets, the ceremonial banners. There are the cooks and the bakers and the brewers, working in the temple kitchens, preparing the god's meals and the feasts for the major festivals. There are the servants and the slaves, captured in warfare from rival cities, who perform the back-breaking labour of hauling water, cleaning the courtyards, carrying supplies. And there are the priestesses, the high priestess, women of noble birth, who serve as the god's consorts. The most famous of these was the priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur. She lived in a special residence called the Yipar, a cloister within the temple complex. She was married to the god in a symbolic sense, forbidden from marrying a mortal man. Her life was one of ritual and prayer, of maintaining the sacred connection between the divine and the earthly realms. Some texts hint at a ritual called the sacred marriage, where the priestess and the king would perform a ceremonial union, representing the marriage of the goddess Inanna to the shepherd god Dumuzi, ensuring fertility for the land. Whether this was purely symbolic or involved actual physical union is a matter of scholarly debate, but the ritual's importance is unquestioned. The temple is also a centre of learning. In the Aduba, the tablet house or school, young boys from wealthy families come to learn the scribal arts. The curriculum is demanding. First, they learn the hundreds of cuneiform signs, each one painstakingly copied onto practice tablets until their hand is steady and their strokes are perfect. Then they learn mathematics, the base 60 system that allows them to calculate areas of fields, volumes of grain storage, compound interest on loans. They learn the literary classics, copying out portions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the hymns to various gods. They learn the legal formulae needed to draw up contracts and settle disputes. The teachers, themselves scribes of long experience, are strict. Beatings for sloppy work are routine. The students work from dawn until dusk, their fingers cramping from gripping the stylus. their eyes straining to read the tiny wedge-shaped marks by lamplight. But the reward is worth it. A trained scribe can find employment anywhere. In the palace managing the king's correspondence. In the temple keeping the divine accounts. In the marketplace writing contracts for merchants. Literacy is power, and only a tiny fraction of the population possesses it. As midday approaches, the heat becomes oppressive. Sumerian summers are brutal, the sun beating down mercilessly on the mudrick buildings. The temple courtyards empty as people seek shade. But the work does not stop. In the inner sanctuaries, priests continue the endless round of rituals. Incense must be burned at prescribed intervals. Sacred lamps must be refilled with oil. The god statue must be attended to, kept clean, kept beautiful, kept honoured. Every moment of every day someone is performing some act of worship. The connection to the divine cannot be allowed to lapse even for an instant. In the evening the cycle repeats, the god is served his second meal. The offerings are presented, the prayers are chanted, and then, as the sun sets and darkness falls over the city, comes the most intimate ritual of all. The god must be put to bed. The priests approach the sanctuary once more. They remove the god's day garments and dress him in night clothes. They escort the statue, or the divine essence it contains, to the bedchamber at the very top of the ziggurat. This chamber, exposed to the stars, is where the god spends the night. Some texts suggest that the god's wife, his divine consort, joins him there. The cosmos itself is imagined as a household, with the god and goddess retiring to their private quarters, while their servants, humanity, rest in the courtyards below. The temple is closed for the night. Guards take up positions at the gates. The sacred fire in the eternal brazier continues to burn, tended by priests who work in shifts, ensuring it never goes out. To let the sacred fire die would be an omen of doom. The smoke rising from that flame is a constant signal to the heavens. Here, it says, is a place where the gods are remembered. Here is a place where humans still serve. Here the covenant between heaven and earth endures. This is the rhythm of post-flood Sumerian religious life. Day after day, year after year, century after century. The rituals never change. Or rather, they change only very slowly, with each generation adding small refinements, interpreting ancient texts, consulting the wisdom of the past. The priests see themselves as guardians of a tradition that stretches back to the very moment when kingship descended from heaven and civilization began anew. But the temples are not only about daily rituals. Throughout the year, the cities celebrate festivals, and these festivals are where the cosmic drama of the gods is reenacted in spectacular public ceremonies. The most important is the Akitu, the New Year festival, celebrated in the spring when the barley is planted, and in the fall when it is harvested. This festival lasted 12 days and involved the entire city. On the first day, the high priest would rise before dawn and recite a prayer to Marduk, the chief god of Babylon in later periods, though in earlier Sumerian times this role belonged to different gods depending on the city. The prayer recounts the creation of the world, the battle against chaos, the establishment of order. It is a reminder that the cosmos is always under threat, that the forces of chaos are always pressing in, and that only through constant vigilance and proper worship can order be maintained. On the fourth day, the entire Enuma Elish creation epic is recited, every word, every line taking hours to complete. The people listen, standing in the temple courtyards, as the story of how Marduk defeated Tiamat and created the world from her corpse is told once again. This is not entertainment. This is cosmic maintenance. By reciting the story, by remembering it, the people help to keep the world stable. The myth is not something that happened once long ago. It is something that must be continually reenacted, continually retold, or the world will slip back into chaos. On the fifth day comes a dramatic reversal. The king is brought to the temple. He is stripped of his royal regalia, his crown removed, his sceptre taken away. The high priest slaps him across the face, pulls his ears, forces him to kneel before the statue of the god. The king must recite a negative confession, declaring that he has not sinned, that he has not neglected the city, that he has ruled justly. The priest then restores the king's crown and declares that the god has renewed his mandate. This ritual humiliation serves multiple purposes. It reminds the king that his power comes from the gods, not from himself. It reassures the people that their king has been judged and found worthy, and it provides a ritualized moment where the social order is inverted, where even the highest human authority must bow before the divine. On the 8th day, the statues of the gods from neighbouring cities are brought to Babylon or Nippur or whichever city is hosting the festival. These statues, each representing a different deity, are carried in solemn procession through the streets. The people line the roads, throwing flowers, singing hymns, weeping with religious fervour. The gods have come to visit. The divine council is assembling. This is the earthly reflection of a cosmic meeting where the fates for the coming year will be decreed. On the 11th day comes the central mystery, the sacred marriage. In the most elaborate version, the king takes the role of the god Dumuzi, the shepherd god, and the end priestess takes the role of Inanna, the goddess of love and fertility. They enter a special chamber in the temple. What happens there is never described explicitly in the texts, but the symbolism is clear. The union of god and goddess ensures the fertility of the land. When they emerge, the crops will grow, the flocks will multiply, the city will prosper. Some scholars believe this was purely symbolic, a ritual enacted in words and gestures. Others point to more explicit texts from later periods and suggest that the sacred marriage involved actual sexual intercourse, a hieros gamos, a holy union that collapsed the boundary between heaven and earth for a single transcendent moment. The festival concludes on the 12th day with feasting and celebration. The gates of the temple storehouses are thrown open, and food is distributed to the people. Beer flows freely, musicians play in the streets. There is dancing, laughter, a sense of renewal. The cosmic order has been reaffirmed. The gods have blessed the king. The coming year will be prosperous. Until the next crisis, the next drought, the next war, the next moment when the people must turn once and again to the temples and beg the gods for mercy. These festivals were not optional. They were essential to the functioning of the universe. The Sumerians believed that the world existed in a state of constant tension between order and chaos. The gods had established order, the me, the divine decrees that kept everything in its proper place. But that order was fragile. It required maintenance, reinforcement, constant attention. The rituals were not symbolic acts of piety. They were real work, cosmic labour, as necessary as ploughing a field or repairing a canal. Without the rituals, the world would collapse. This worldview permeated every aspect of Sumerian life. You could not simply do as you pleased. There were right ways and wrong ways to do everything, and the right ways were determined by the gods through the me. There were proper days for planting and improper days. There were foods that could be eaten on some days but not others. There were rituals that must be performed before beginning any significant task, whether that task was building a house, digging a well, or going to war. The people lived in a state of constant awareness of the divine. When a storm rolled in from the desert, that was Enlil, the storm god, announcing his presence. When the rivers flooded, that was the decision of Ea, Shipur, who controlled the Abzu, the subterranean waters. When a woman became pregnant, that was the gift of Nintu, the mother goddess. When a child died of fever, that was the work of Namtar, the demon of disease, sent perhaps because a ritual had been neglected or a taboo violated. Nothing happened by accident. Everything was connected to the vast web of divine will. And yet, for all this cosmic supervision, the Sumerians did not live in a state of cowering fear. They negotiated with their gods. They bargained. They complained. The prayers preserved on clay tablets are remarkably human in their tone. A man whose business has failed does not simply accept it as divine judgment. He argues his case before the god. I have always been faithful, he says. I have brought my offerings. I have performed the rituals. Why have you abandoned me? There is an intimacy in these prayers, a sense that the gods, despite their immense power, are still in some fundamental way people. They can be flattered, persuaded, reminded of past favours, even scolded for neglect. This is the world the Anunnaki created after the flood, a world where humanity and divinity existed in constant complex interaction, where the line between the two was real but permeable, where humans served the gods, yes, but where the gods also needed humans, needed the offerings, the prayers, the smoke of the sacrifices rising into heaven. It was a symbiotic relationship, and both parties had obligations. But what of the ordinary people, those who were not priests or kings or scribes? What was life like for the farmer, the potter, the fisherman? The archaeological record gives us a glimpse. Ordinary homes in Sumerian cities were built around central courtyards, providing privacy and shade. The houses were made of mud brick. Like everything else, with the flat roofs that served as additional living space during the hot summer nights. Inside, there was remarkably little furniture by modern standards. People sat on mats on the floor, They slept on reed mattresses. Storage jars lined the walls containing grain, dried fish, dates, beer. Most families kept a small household shrine, a niche in the wall, where clay figurines of their personal gods were kept. These personal gods were not the great cosmic deities worshipped in the temples. They were family guardians, spiritual protectors who watched over the household and interceded with the greater gods on the family's behalf. Every morning, the head of the household would say a brief prayer before this shrine, asking for protection, for health, for success in the day's endeavours. Work defined life. Farmers woke before dawn to tend their fields, using the sophisticated irrigation canals that networked through the land. These canals were communal property, maintained by the entire city, and their upkeep was overseen by temple administrators. Failure to maintain the canals was a serious offence, as everyone depended on them for survival. The Instructions to a Farmer, a Sumerian agricultural text that has survived, reads like a technical manual, explaining in detail how to plough, when to irrigate, how to protect the crop from birds, when to harvest, how to thresh and winnow. This knowledge, the Sumerians believed, had been given to them by Enki after the flood. It was divine wisdom, practical and life-sustaining. Craftsmen worked in small workshops, often specialising in a single trade. Potters shaped clay on wheels, creating the storage jars, the bowls, the cups that every household needed. Metalworkers forged bronze tools and weapons, heating copper and tin in furnaces fueled by charcoal, hammering the alloy into shape on stone anvils. Weavers worked massive looms, creating the textiles that clothed the population and were also a major trade good. Jewellers carved beads from carnelian and lapis lazuli, creating the ornaments that adorned both the living and the dead. Women's lives were but circumscribed by their roles as wives and mothers, but they were not powerless. In Sumerian law, women could own property, engage in business, and initiate divorce in certain circumstances. Wealthy women, especially those connected to the temples, could wield considerable influence. The end priestesses, as we have seen, were figures of enormous religious and social significance. Even ordinary women participated in economic life, running market stalls, brewing beer commercially, weaving textiles for sale. Children were raised collectively, with extended families sharing child-rearing responsibilities. Boys from wealthy families might attend the scribal schools, girls learned domestic skills from their mothers and aunts. All children, regardless of status, learned the stories of the gods, the myths of creation, the tale of the flood, and the importance of maintaining proper relationship with the divine. These stories were their history, their science, their moral education, all rolled into one, and at the bottom of society were the slaves, prisoners captured in the endless wars between city-states. Their lives were hard, but not necessarily short. Slaves could sometimes purchase their freedom, could marry, could even, in rare cases, rise to positions of responsibility as overseers or skilled craftsmen. The institution of slavery was accepted without question. It was part of the cosmic order, established by the gods as natural and inevitable as the seasons. This, then, is the civilization the Anunnaki rebuilt after the flood. Complex, sophisticated, deeply religious, intensely hierarchical. A civilization that balanced cosmic dread with everyday pragmatism, that saw the divine in everything while simultaneously developing legal systems, irrigation networks, international trade, literature, art and mathematics. They built a world that worked, that could sustain itself, that could pass on knowledge from generation to generation. They built a world that would last for thousands of years, influencing every civilization that came after. And then, as we have noted, the gods began to withdraw. The direct appearances stopped. The clear instructions faded. The temples continued to function, the rituals continued to be performed, but the sense of immediate divine presence, that feeling that the gods were right there watching, guiding, intervening, that sense slowly diminished. The Anunnaki, having set the machine in motion, stepped back to watch it run. We built empires. We wrote epics. We developed new technologies and explored new ideas. We carried forward the knowledge they had given us, added to it, transformed it, made it our own. And all the while, buried beneath the sands of Iraq and Syria, the tablets waited. The oldest stories waited. The memory of what happened after the flood waited. Until a young British museum assistant named George Smith, hunched over a fragment of clay in a dusty archive room, suddenly realised what he was reading. Until the academic world had to confront the fact that the biblical flood had an older, more complex origin. until we had to grapple with the possibility that our ancient ancestors were trying to tell us something important, something we had forgotten. The moment of Smith's discovery in 1872 was itself dramatic. He was translating fragments from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, tablets that had been excavated from the ruins of Nineveh and shipped to the British Museum. As he worked through one particular tablet, part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, he realised he was reading a flood story. A story of a man warned by a god to build a boat. A story of animals taken aboard. A story of a dove and a raven sent out to find dry land. A story that predated the Bible by more than 1,000 years. Legend says that Smith became so excited he began to dance around the room, and then, overcome with emotion, he started to remove his clothing. Whether this last detail is apocryphal or not, his excitement was real and justified. He had found proof that the biblical narrative had ancient roots, that the stories of Genesis were not unique revelations but drew upon older traditions. When he presented his findings to the Society of Biblical Archaeology, the announcement made international headlines. The British Prime Minister attended his lectures. The story of Gilgamesh's flood survivor Utnapishtim became a sensation. But Smith's discovery was only the beginning. As more tablets were translated, as the full scope of Sumerian and Babylonian literature emerged, scholars realised they were looking at an entire lost world of thought and belief. They were reading the actual words of people who had lived 4,000 years ago, people who were trying to explain their origins, their purpose, their relationship with forces they could not control. And those people, consistently and insistently, credited everything they had achieved to the gods who came down after the flood and taught them how to rebuild. The modern debate over how to interpret these texts continues. Are they pure mythology, the imaginative attempts of primitive people to make sense of their world? Are they garbled memories of real historical events, catastrophes and migrations and encounters with advanced knowledge? Are they, as the most radical theorists suggest, literal accounts of extraterrestrial intervention or contact with a lost advanced human civilization? Each generation of scholars approaches the tablets with new tools, new perspectives, new questions, and the tablets, patient and enduring, continue to yield new insights. What we can say with certainty is that the Sumerian account of post-flood reconstruction describes a systematic, organised effort. Cities were not founded randomly, but according to a plan. Eridu first, the sacred centre, then the other 4 pre-flood cities, rebuilt and repopulated, then new cities, spreading northward, each with its patron deity, each with its temple, each with its role in the larger economic and religious network. Knowledge was not rediscovered through trial and error, but was distributed deliberately. The ME were given by the gods. Kingship was lowered from heaven. The social order was established according to divine decree. Whether this system was literally created by gods or extraterrestrials, whether it emerged from survivors of an earlier civilization passing on their knowledge, or whether it developed naturally as human societies recovered from a catastrophic flood and mythologized their own achievements, the result was the same. Within a remarkably short time, southern Mesopotamia transformed from scattered flood-ravaged settlements into a network of thriving city-states with writing, law, monumental architecture, complex religious institutions, and sophisticated agricultural and economic systems. The blueprint for civilization itself was established in those first post-flood centuries. Everything that came after, from Babylon to Rome to the modern world, built upon that foundation. The tablets reveal what the Anunnaki did after the flood. They rebuilt, they taught, they guided, they established the foundations upon which all subsequent civilizations would be built. And then, when their work was done, they left us with a gift more valuable than gold, more lasting than the greatest temple. They left us with the memory of what we came from, recorded in the world's oldest writing, waiting for the day when we would be ready to read it again and ask the deepest questions. Who made us? Why are we here? Are we alone in the universe? And if we are not, if there are others out there, others who once walked among us and taught us and then departed, what would they think of us now? Would they be proud of what we have built? Would they be disappointed by what we have destroyed? Would they recognize us as the same species they once called their workers, their servants, their children? The tablets do not tell us these things. They cannot see into the future. But they preserve the past, and in that preservation they offer us a mirror. They show us where we came from. They show us the moment when civilization began, not once but twice. They show us the catastrophe that nearly ended us, and they show us the help we receive to rise again. Whether that help came from gods, from aliens, from other humans, or from the resilient ingenuity of our own species, the story remains the same. We were knocked down, we got back up, we built, we remembered, and we became who we are, the descendants of the first people to put words into clay, the inheritors of a legacy that stretches back 6,000 years to the muddy shores of the first cities after the flood. The Anunnaki's work after the deluge was not simply reconstruction, it was a reimagining of what humanity could be, and in a very real sense, we are still living in the world they built. Our cities, our laws, our writing, our sense of time itself, all of it traces back to those first post-flood settlements in Sumer. The shadow of the ziggurat, the echo of the flood, the memory of gods who once walked the earth, these things are woven into the deepest fabric of our civilization. And now, as you lie here in the darkness, your breathing slow and steady, your mind drifting between sleep and waking, you carry with you this ancient knowledge. You know what the tablets say. You know what the oldest written words on earth tell us about our past. Whether you believe them, well, literally. Whether you see them as myth and metaphor, or whether you fall somewhere in the uncertain middle, you cannot unhear what they whisper across the millennia. We were made, we were destroyed, we were saved, we were taught. We were given a second chance, and we took it. The rest, as they say, is history. But what a history it is, and what a beginning. The tablets sit in museums now behind glass, their clay surfaces marked with the wedge-shaped impressions of reeds, pressed by hands that turned to dust thousands of years ago. But the words remain, the stories remain, the questions remain, and somewhere perhaps the Anunnaki remain as well, watching, waiting, wondering if the species they created or discovered, the workers they taught or the children they raised, have finally grown up enough to seek them out again, to ask them face to face what they did after the flood, to hear the answer not from clay but from living voices. Until that day, if it ever comes, we have the tablets, we have the stories, we have the memory preserved in the oldest writing on earth, and we have the cities they helped us build, layer upon layer, rising from the mud, reaching toward heaven, just as the first ziggurat did in ancient Eridu, when kingship descended from heaven and the world began again. Rest now. Let these ancient stories settle into your mind like sediment in still water. Let the voices of the scribes who scratched these tales into wet clay fade into the background hum of deep time. The Anunnaki's work is done. Your work, the simple work of sleep, of rest, of renewal, now begins. Civilization can wait until morning. History can wait. The questions can wait. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and drift back through the centuries, past the Persians and the Babylonians and the Akkadians, past the third dynasty of Ur and the early dynastic period, past the first writing and the first cities, past the flood itself, down to the moment when the waters receded and the sun broke through the clouds and a single boat rested on new ground. Ziusudra opens the window. The world is clean. The world is quiet. The world is ready to begin again. And so are you. Sleep well. The morning will come, as it always does, and with it the world rebuilt, again and again and again, by hands both human and divine, by knowledge both earned and given, by survivors who remember, and children who dream. This is what the tablets tell us. This is what the Anunnaki did after the flood. They gave us the chance to start over, and we, remarkably, took it. Now rest. The story is told, the knowledge is past, and the ancient clay, somewhere far away in a museum archive, holds its secrets still, waiting for the next person to ask, to wonder, to read the oldest words on earth, and feel the weight of that tremendous gift. Civilization, knowledge, a second chance, sweet dreams.